Welcome, first of all, to the 40th Annual Hawaii International Film Festival presented by Halekulani Hotel. And this is our HIFF Talk Story session on the rise of the scripted podcast. Program updates for up-to-date information on the whole schedule of films, events, HIFF Talk Story sessions, Q&As, any additions to the program, please go to hiff.org. That's HIFF.org. Also, please consider making a donation, a contribution to our HIFF40 for 40 fundraising campaign and help the Hawaii International Film Festival raise $40,000 by the end of the festival to ensure that HIFF continues its mission of being the film festival record for the Asia Pacific Rim. So for more details on that, again, go to the HIFF website, hiff.org /40-FOR-40. And you can just find all that information there on hiff.org. At the end of before we get to the Q&A, I want to also kind of let you know that if anyone has questions that they want to leave for any of the panelists that we can try to get to during the discussion, please leave them for it. If you're on Zoom, there's a Q&A kind of box on Zoom where you can leave any questions. If you're on Facebook, just leave it in the comments. And we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So without further ado, let's get this started. Let's introduce all the panelists, if we can bring everybody on screen. Matt's already here, so let me start by introducing Matt Schrader. So let me read your quick bio so I get everything right. Matt Schrader is the creator of the Blockbuster podcast, which is the back-to-back winner of Adweek's Creative Podcast of the Year. Season 1, we'll get into both seasons, but season 1 tells the story of a young George Lucas and Steven Spielberg as they start their careers, and I'm sure everyone here knows who they are, Steven Spielberg, Jaws, E.T., Close Encounters, George Lucas, Star Wars, just in case. Second season, which just wrapped up like a month or two ago, very recently, tells the story of another filmmaker, James Cameron, best known for Titanic. And we'll talk about all those. He's also a 3-time Emmy-winning producer, filmmaker, director of the hit Score film music documentary, which premiered here, which had a screening here at HIFF a few years ago. And I'm also kind of curious because I think it was like the #1 movie on iTunes and Amazon for the documentaries for 5 weeks. But I found this in your bio that I thought was kind of interesting. It was also the most pirated documentary of 2017 as well. And we can talk about that in a little bit as well. Before he kind of founded his company, Epiclef, he was also an award-winning news producer, editor for outlets like CBS and NBC. So welcome, Matt, virtually to this podcast. And then we have Holly Hines. Say hi, Holly. I'm sure people know which one's Holly, but just in case. Holly is the head of network development for Spotify Studios. And in that position, she oversees all the scripted fiction and unscripted content for Spotify, which has 248 million monthly active users. So that's a lot of people. She previously was a senior vice president at Dynamic Television and the senior vice president for scripted programming for Pivot, overseeing shows like Fortitude and Please Like Me. She's also been involved with other shows in the past like The Office, Tutors, Trading Spaces, Ugly Betty, Nashville Star. So please welcome Holly. Welcome and mahalo for you to join us virtually. Obviously, we're not all in Hawaii, as people can tell, unfortunately, this year because of the pandemic. And then finally, last but not least, we have Josh Lindgren. Josh has been a podcast agent since 2014 and has been an agent at the Creative Artists Agency, CAA, since 2018. And he reps some of the biggest names in the audio space, just a few of them, Stuff You Should Know, Snap Judgment, NPR's Ari Shapiro, producers like Little Everywhere, Salt Audio, Maximum Fun, Futuro Media Group. He's also brokered deals for some major production houses getting into the space, like Jordan Peele's Monkey Paw Productions, Mick Jagger's Rainy Day Podcast, Jamie Lee Curtis's Comet Pictures, and Steve Michaels' Oddity. So welcome to our panel as well, Josh. So thank you everybody for joining us. And again, if you have any questions you want to leave, in the Q&A chat in Zoom or in the comments on Facebook on the HIFF fan page or on the HIFF page. So I'm going to ask you all to talk a little bit about what you actually do in your positions in a bit. But before I do that, I wanted to kind of see, there's a lot of people I think watching this who probably maybe don't know what a scripted podcast is. They may know what podcasts are. And even that term, scripted podcast, I know some people like to use different terms like audio drama and, scripted audio and all the, some other terms as well. So who wants to kind of explain exactly what a scripted podcast is, and kind of what it is that, that definition encompasses? Josh, I think you might be the best person to start off.
I'd be happy to. Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me. Wish I could be there in person. It's snowing where I am right now in Minneapolis. So scripted podcast, it's a little bit of a misnomer, I think, for some people in the podcast space. The term really comes from TV, where we talk about scripted television and unscripted, non-scripted, or TV alt, different terms for non-scripted television. It's a pretty useful distinction in the TV world between the different types of content that's being created. And so it's had kind of a natural crossover into the podcast world to describe essentially audio fiction for the most part, like radio plays are the types of things we're usually talking about when we say scripted audio. Some podcasters object to it because they say, well, I script out my, doc series podcast, or I script this or that. And it's not about whether there's a script or not. It's sort of a general all-encompassing term to try and talk about these sort of radio play style podcasts that have really been growing a lot in the last few years in particular.
And Josh, kind of what type of forms does it take? Are we talking like episodic series, or is it kind of the equivalent of movies or plays? Like what does kind of that definition encompass?
Sure. I mean, it tends to be episodic for the most part. There are a few exceptions of shows that have been sort of more of a feature film style where it's one solid audio file. But for the most part, people are generally more receptive to consuming these in an episodic form. They can be released week by week over time, or they can be released all at once. I mean, if you take like the Audible model, for example, they're doing a lot of these shows and they're sort of fitting them into the model of like an audiobook. So it's broken up into chapters, but you get the whole thing at once, right? Versus people who are releasing more through the podcast space that tend to fit more into the podcast paradigm of releasing an episode once a week over the course of 6 weeks, 10 weeks, however long the run is for the season. So I mean, there's no rules, and something that's great about the podcast space is because it's digital media and because it's so emergent that people can try new stuff all the time. So, there's no one way that it has to be, but I would say most of it's pretty episodic.
Okay. Then let's talk a little bit about kind of what each of you does in his or her position. So Holly, so your actual title is Head of Network Development. What does that actually mean, and kind of what do you do at Spotify in the podcast space?
Yeah, absolutely. It is funny though, just to go back when I first started, it was a really big conversation about what was scripted and what was unscripted, and there were so many. Just when I started, it was, okay, let's define terms and get on the same page. And what does that mean to you? And so there's a lot of conversations of scripted narrative fiction, involving actors versus a single voice narration. And it's, it's a big conversation that's still happening. So I think Josh, you did a great job with, breaking it down. So I work across Spotify. We have 4 studios in-house, which are the recently acquired Ringer, we have Gimlet, we have our internal house brand that we call Studio 4, and we have Parcast. So basically each one has a different focus, and I look at programming and decide kind of working with the heads of those studios on what fits the brand the best. Obviously Gimlet, everyone knows it's our premier brand. A lot of for the TV world, I refer to it as the HBO, with doing they've been really innovative in their scripted narrative fiction. So our scripted podcast, starting with everything from Homecoming to Princes to Mother Hacker. The Ringer obviously is with Bill Simmons, and we focus on sports and pop culture, and it's a lot of at the mic. So we call it at the mic or edited at the mic, where you're basically speaking into a microphone and it's in pretty much real time. Parcast has gotten its, its bread and butter has been the crime and the thriller. And so we've recently started to expand that brand into a Gen Z female. We know that women love watching about crime and thrillers. I think that they're kind of like, I got away from it. And so it's a natural, seemingly unnatural, but a natural progression. And then Studio 4 really, it highlights who we are as a company. So our focus, we actually now have 320 million active users a month, and of them, 144 are paid subscribers. But the thing that's really interesting about our platform is that our average age is around 26. And so a lot of distribution platforms, their age is a lot older, but we're a very diverse, very young platform. And that's really what our Studio 4 brand represents. So we look at On the Mic, we look at deep dive documentary, and we look at scripted fiction. And those are the arenas that I work across.
All right. Thank you very much. And then Matt, so everyone on the panel kind of represents a different area. Holly, obviously, Spotify, which produces and buys, podcasts and ideas and develops them. Josh as an agent on the selling side. Matt, you're the creator in this. So
yes.
What does that entail when you're kind of working in this space? What does that mean? What do you do? Like, what does a creator, producer, director in this space do?
Sure. Well, what I can speak for what we've tried to do, which is basically build a small team of people kind of based on the, indie filmmaking model a little bit and try to rig that around scripted podcasts. So now we're working across 3 or 4 different podcasts, about to start on our 4th, that we're kind of working on all at the same time. And it is really everything from, we're involved in everything from the execution of a couple projects that are essentially written already to developing something from the pitch level onward, basically, and writing it out and figuring out what's going to work best to try to innovate in a kind of sonic way and in a musical way, and to make all of those pieces somehow come together in the audience's experience and the listening experience. So our focus is really about, I think, trying to find the best experience possible. And we've been fortunate so far to have a little bit of success there, and now some projects that are aligning with things that help. One of the big interruptions of scripted podcasts specifically is, you got to put ads someplace. And if you're trying to create an immersive world, which is something that isn't maybe necessarily the case in a conversation style podcast, it's a little bit more intrusive in scripted. So we've been trying to figure out ways to make that work. I know one of our shows has a partnership with a sponsor that is basically doing the whole season. So that's great. We're excited about that. But we're really about trying to find a way to do something that's a little bit different and hopefully something that's fresh. It is a unique kind of direction on the creative side.
Great. And then finally, Josh, I think most people watching this probably know what an agent does, a traditional film or TV agent. How is being a podcast agent any different, or is it pretty much the same thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. In some ways it's similar to other types of agenting. In some ways it's just totally weird and different. I'd say the biggest way that it's different is because this is such an emerging field that we're still defining sort of the boundaries of what the job even is, let alone the boundaries of sort of what the medium is and the types of deals that we can make. So, in the course of my day, I represent people who are voicing podcasts, talent, hosts, etc. People who are basically below the line producers, podcast networks, a whole range of sort of different people who are involved in the creation of a podcast. If I were a motion picture or a TV agent, there'd be like 8 different types of TV agents for specific parts of the industry that represent specific types of creators. And in podcasting, we might reach that point, where it's such a large industry that there's a lot more segmentation in terms of what we do. But for now, I find myself involved in these deals where I have so many different parties involved and contributing in different ways. But the essence of my job is that I broker deals between storytellers and people who are monetizing those stories.
And I'm assuming, like, for people who don't know, CAA is one of the big agencies in Hollywood, one of the biggest. And within that, in addition to kind of representing clients who just do podcasts, you're obviously also representing the quote unquote more traditional, clients who want to kind of explore that space, right? Mm-hmm. So even at a big agency like CAA, it's still a very small department, like you said, right? Because it is something that's still very new. So I was kind of curious, how many, kind of agents are working, kind of in this space in even at a big agency like CAA? Yeah,
we have 10 agents in the space right now. So, definitely not a tiny department, but it's small compared to the television department, for sure. It's small compared to motion picture. We have a good group, but we're all kind of involved in all the parts of the business, right? So we're not at a point in the industry where we'd have okay, this is a podcast lit agent that works with people who write podcasts, right? And then this is a podcast talent agent who works with podcast actors or podcast hosts, right? We're kind of more involved in all the different parts of the business. We have a bit more specialization around genre, where we have certain agents that tend to do more sports podcasts, certain agents who tend to do more podcasts focused on particular areas, people who do a little bit more scripted versus more talk show style stuff. But it's not at the place where television is, just in terms of differentiation of the different roles. Well, yet. And maybe one day, yes. You mentioned that I started representing podcasters in 2014. The change that I've seen, I started working in this field before Serial, and the change that we've seen the last 6-7 years is just kind of remarkable. I could only imagine 6 or 7 more years, what the podcast audio industry looks like. Yeah. And in a minute, I'm going to ask you, Josh, to actually give us a history of kind of scripted podcasts. But before we get to the nuts and bolts of things, again, for the people out there who aren't really familiar with this format, this genre, I wanted to kind of see what everyone's favorite, either your favorite kind of scripted podcast, and Holly, you're completely welcome to plug just purely Spotify projects if you want. And also, and if it's different, also what are some kind of, either key or iconic, kind of scripted podcasts that you think, listeners should listen to kind of get familiar with the space. So Holly, why don't we start with you?
Okay. So I'm actually going to give one that we did not do, but I have the pleasure right now of working with the creators, and it's called Gay Future. And I've mentioned it a few times when I've talked to people. I think that it's a comedy, which is really difficult to do. One of the things that I really like about it is the use of narration is quite minimal. And so it just kind of sets the scene and then gets you into it. It's a lot of inaction. They're also able to, they utilize the audio platform in a really smart way. And there's some action sequences that they're able to do and physical humor that's very difficult to pull off, that I haven't seen before. Other ones that I have responded to, obviously Mother Hacker is something that's exceptional, as well as, and these are, Gimlet, they do amazing things. So The Two Princes, I think also is really interesting. What I'm really responding to is in scene and not a lot of narration. I have found that I get pitched the same thing over and over again, which is a fake podcast and a podcast. And so a lot of people come oh my God, I've got this crazy meta idea. And it's yes, I have heard it. And so I think that what we've seen in our research is that was a great transition to really get unscripted audiences who were interested in podcasts and then interested in making that leap into fiction podcasts. And it's kind of an easy listening. Like you can do that and do other things. But we found that most of those that are really successful have been done before, like let's say 2018 they came out. The ones that have come out after that just haven't performed as well. What we're really seeing is in scene, in being there with the action, following the protagonist. You know, we had talked about it a little bit further. Matt had talked about like, this is an incredibly intimate medium. Like they're literally in your ears, they're in your head. And so you've got this theater of the mind that you're able to tap into. And so authenticity of voice, like who is the writer creator, what are they trying to say, all of those things I think really drive in. So yeah, those are my favorite and what I like about them.
Yeah, I think you raised an interesting point, so we can diverge a little bit. I think some people, you know, who aren't familiar with the format might think that scripted podcasts, like you said, a lot of them might think that, oh, it has to kind of be formatted like I'm a podcaster doing a fake podcast, you know, that kind of very meta thing. But, you know, what's interesting about, you know, the shows that I'm listening to now is they really just cover the gamut, you know, in terms of like kind of stylistically, you know, kind of the format. So some of them are literally like TV shows, except without the picture, right? There's no narration. Yeah. You know, it's all dialogue and kind of sound design, you know, or like Blockbuster with Matt, it's kind of a combination, you know, both where you have, you know, some narration, but a lot of it is kind of, you know, scenes that you would see in a film or TV show. So I think we want to just kind of, you know, make sure that people understand that it's not just like, oh, it's narration and it's this, or you have to pretend it's a real podcast, you know, for it to work. So with that, moving on to you, Matt, you know, we're obviously going to talk a lot about Blockbuster, you know, with you during this, but, you know, aside from Blockbuster, like what are other scripted podcasts that either you like or that you would recommend to people who might not be familiar with the format?
Sure. Well, I think the lens that I am using to view a lot of podcasts is a little bit different. It's not quite the same as looking for something that's interesting and looking, you know, the way that your kind of average person would go after, you know, kind of browsing through or skimming through podcasts. I'm a little bit more interested, and maybe I've let this dominate too much, in people that are exploring the sonic space in kind of new and interesting ways and doing things. You know, you're never going to replace great writing. You know, I'm a big believer that, you know, a great writer is more important than almost anything else. But there are a lot of scripted podcasts that are doing fairly bare bones work right now, using a lot of kind of stock sound and stock music. Especially music is the place where I feel it the most, or sometimes the least. But I've really I mean, Gimlet is a great example of a studio that's doing super interesting things. Everything is done, you know, top notch. Q Code has done some things like that. I've been impressed with some of the work that they've done on their shows. So I'm a little bit more. I'm looking for like those moments that will make me go, wow, I never would have thought about doing something that way. And I have a great example. I always think of like Breaking Bad, which has, you know, these amazing kind of opening sequences in a lot of the episodes where there's no dialogue. It's all just pictures and sound and, you know, close-ups of one thing happening and then something else happening. And it's all in your brain. You're putting it all together to where the end you see, oh, this just set up the entire episode and what's going to happen. A lot of times they would return to that at the end of the episode. But I feel like a lot of what sound can do is really similar to that. And if you can build a sequence that's powerful, using music, using, you know, sound effects that are more than just, you know, one sound effect underneath a music bed, you can actually create this sequence where you feel like you're in the middle of it and it's doing things that words can't.
Yeah. So do you have an example of a podcast you'd like to recommend that fits that definition of what you're looking for? I'm curious. What? Yeah,
I mean, I think it's, I would probably look at some of the Q Code series like Blackout and Carrier that have been pretty strong, I think, in that department. So yeah, I think it's like, you know, we're looking for, and there's the big challenge in this, and this is something that I would be interested in hearing the other participants' thought in as well, is this challenge of how to basically get rid of narration, but still be clear about what's happening in a scene. You have to paint that scene somehow, but also you don't want all your dialogue to be, oh my God, why are you holding that gun pointed at me? It's like, you don't want something that's going to be the most eye-rolly, terrible dialogue ever to try to explain what's happening. So I think that's one challenge where it almost needs to be addressed at the story concept level before anything is even written, so that you can start to have some strategy of, this is going to be really confusing, how can we try to pull this off and still have it be clear to a listener once we get through writing all of this and then putting all the sound and music and everything else together.
Yeah. We will talk about that in a sec. I have some specific questions to ask everyone about that too. But Josh, just to get in any recommendations that you have before we get into the nuts and bolts.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, these two have covered a lot that I really am passionate about as well. A lot of really great shows. I do think that a shout out is due to some of the independent podcasters who were making scripted podcasts before they were called scripted podcasts. For instance, Welcome to Night Vale has been doing this for a long time, as a huge audience, and is still going strong. The Adventure Zone from the McElroy brothers, great example of an improvised scripted show that's doing really well. Welcome to Hello from the Magic Tavern, another great improvised scripted show I've enjoyed for years and years and years. I think that those Q Code shows referenced, in particular Blackout from Malik was such a great moment because it showed people that scripted shows could have big name actors, and it was an example of a production that had director and writer and all these parts coming together, versus something like, say, Girl in Space, another show that I love, and it was totally made, from the vision of one woman who, played a part and wrote it and directed and produced. It's sort of, and these shows are great. I think that Blackout showed an interesting moment of podcasting starting to look a little bit more like Hollywood. And I think there's been a lot of great shows that have come since. I mean, something that came out this last summer that I'm really proud of is a show called Letters from Camp, starring Jamie Lee Curtis and created by her and her goddaughter, Boko Heft. Just a really fun genre YA show that I enjoyed a lot. And also, I mean, at the end of last year, Moonface, I think was a really good example of a podcast. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And The Shadows too, for sure. And I think actually both of those really illustrate another turning point in scripted podcasts, which is the introduction of something that feels like an indie film, So like if Blackout or if Carrier are sort of your blockbuster, action, shows with big talent, I think, not that there's not great talent also in those shows, but like Moonface felt so much more like something I would expect to see at a festival like HIFF, And
Moonface, for those who haven't listened to, and because there's a lot of Asian American kind of, and Asian kind of centric work at this festival, is the story of a gay Korean American, kind of young man played by Joel Kim Booster, and kind of his struggles to kind of, especially his relationship with his mom, to kind of come out with his identity. So you're right. It just does have that very kind of indie film type of feel, which was amazing.
Fun fact about it. Also, it was written and produced by a Gimlet documentarian. So James Kem wrote it about a lot of the experiences that he was familiar with. And then, but while he was doing documentaries at Gimlet, and then has gone off to start his own company from there.
Great. Yeah. And then Blackout, just to come back to Blackout and to your point, Matt, that's an example of a scripted podcast where I believe they have no narration in that one, because you were talking about that. And the whole kind of experience is through sound design and dialogue, and, it's this kind of thriller, the premise is that there's actually a blackout that affects the country. And, the way that I thought just the way that they pulled that off, in the writing and especially the sound design, was really incredible. So, pivoting to, I'm going to start back to you, Josh, so that we don't have this pattern of going from Holly to Matt to you. Give us a kind of give listeners, viewers here, a sense of kind of what the space is like out there. I mean, obviously we know Spotify is doing podcasts. You mentioned Audible. like who are the other kind of main, Q Code, we mentioned some of them as well. Who are the other kind of main, kind of players out there, for scripted podcasts? And I know there's a lot of new ones coming down the line, including kind of, heavyweights like Apple, right? Kind of that are getting to the space. So if you could talk a little bit about kind of that landscape and what it looks like now.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a fast-growing landscape. It's probably, one of the areas of podcasting it's growing the quickest right now in terms of content. In addition to the ones you named, iHeartMedia is doing a lot of scripted stuff. There's sort of a growth, some stuff coming from Cadence 13, Wondery. Pretty much most of the major podcast players at this point are developing some kind of scripted arm, not all of them to the same extent, right? I mean, I think that, Spotify was really ahead of the curve on that and has a lot of great stuff in their catalog already. But, we're seeing more and more come online. Also, there are a lot of other entities creating scripted podcasts sort of outside of the realm of these really high budget places. I mean, for instance, one of my favorite scripted shows is a show called Bubble, created by the listener-supported podcast network Maximum Fun. And that show was made on a shoestring, but they still had like a really great cast with some voices that you'd recognize listening to it, which is a really fun show. And I think every day there's more great indie scripted shows happening, and I'm always listening to these up and coming scripted shows. Who's going to be the next James Kim? If there is a next James Kim, right? Who are the creators who are doing this and bootstrapping these things themselves? Because the reality is that you don't need a big Hollywood budget to do it, right? I mean, you don't necessarily need all these moving parts. To Matt's point, there's a difference between things that are really well designed and things that are sort of thrown together. And I think in audio, there's a high bar to cross in terms of not having that uncanny valley effect where you just don't believe the actors. And I think that comes from great writing, from great acting, and really from great sound design and producing. And I think people don't necessarily always notice how much of a difference that makes, and why a show like Carrier, you really believe that you're in it, versus some shows feels more like you're listening to a high school play or something, even with really good actors, it's just harder to believe. So I digressed a bit from your question, but I do think there's a wide range of people who are involved in this space, and I'd be remiss to suggest that it's only a handful of places that are controlling it.
Yeah. And then specifically taking that question to you, Holly, and Spotify, I believe Spotify first got into the podcast space in 2018, right? So a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. And of all the companies, Spotify has been one of the most aggressive. I mean, you talked about, Gimlet and the other kind of companies that you've acquired, and you have a deal now, I believe, with Churn Entertainment to develop some of your podcasts into film and TV. And that's a subject we could talk about a little bit more later as well. And then I think just this morning, you're acquiring Megaphone. That announcement came out, which is an advertising platform for podcasts. So I was kind of curious kind of what, kind of the mission at Spotify was, and what type of podcast are you looking for? I mean, you talked a little bit about that in your intro, but are there specific genres? Are there specific things, especially since you have a younger audience, like you said?
Yeah, I have, and Josh has heard this a few times. I have kind of three main areas that I'm focusing on right now, and it's based off of a ton of insights and research that we've done. Also, we announced a deal earlier in the summer with Warner Brothers in DC, where we're working really closely with them to solely to do scripted podcasts. So we announced our first big partnership from that, where we're working with David Goyer to bring Batman to Spotify. And for us, we've seen, as Josh just kind of talked about it, like the indie nature of what audio narrative fiction can be. And we've seen so many people moving towards it in terms of audiences, but we still think it's in a really nascent stage. So we're really looking, with that deal in particular, of looking at known recognizable IP and putting, you know, really inspiring storytellers and like innovating in this medium. So what we're working on with Batman is incredibly exciting. And I can't tell you anything about it yet, but we're about to start the writer's room, which is really exciting. And you know, we're wanting to look at what's been done, but also like how can we bring more people to this as a medium as a whole. You know, two of the other things that we're looking at is because we're such a young platform, we're wanting to really look at this Gen Z female, 18 to 24, where we're, you know, exploring a lot of programming in this space. We feel like they're an underserved audience in the sense that they're listening to a lot of audio fiction, but not a lot of programming has been directed at them. So we'll be starting to program in that space. We're also looking at something that we kind of feel works really well, which is that elevated genre. So something like a Blackout, something like Carrier, where you've got Welcome to Night Vale, the No Sleep podcast, things that have that creepy paranormal horror. These are things that work really well for men and women in that 18 to 34. So those are kind of the three buckets that I'm programming in. And then obviously with Gimlet, we've got such an amazing team over there that we're doing a lot of things that are a little bit more experimental and potentially outside of those demographics. But just looking at quality of writer and concept. So that's
great.
What I'm doing. Yeah.
And then Matt, Blockbuster kind of, I think, fits into this subgenre that some people have called it a biopod, right? You know, that it's actually kind of a biography. It's kind of, you know, like you're telling the story of how George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, you know, became the filmmakers that they were. So, you know, I was curious, like, kind of, one, what drew you to that topic, you know, of like, hey, I want to tell the story of these kind of iconic filmmakers. And, you know, how did you pick like George Lucas and Steven Spielberg to kind of begin with? And then thirdly, like, why did you decide to kind of do it in this format, you know, as opposed to maybe, you know, kind of an unscripted, you know, kind of cast or a documentary or something else, right?
Yeah, well, the short answer was the idea for Blockbuster started as a screenplay, and very quickly was like, well, that's going to be difficult to make and expensive to make.
Was it Steven Spielberg at the beginning that you were going to follow them?
Yeah. And so, but yeah, I mean, I think the concept of that, the idea of that came from, it traced back probably to when I was making my documentary score about film composers, and came across, you know, this relationship, this creative relationship very early on between Spielberg and John Williams. And then George Lucas and John Williams kind of have their own creative, you know, magic that happens. And then, you know, there's a sequence in that documentary where it's just like, you know, it's like 8 minutes of straight, just like John Williams brilliance. And it's all like Spielberg and, you know, George Lucas, Star Wars, and all of that stuff that changed the world. And I kept coming across these stories about, you know, how George Lucas would visit the set of Jaws, and, you know, he got his head stuck in the shark at one point, and, you know, which is actually something that we didn't put into our series, but I started to basically put on my investigative journalism hat a little bit and try to go back and find what references there were to kind of their friendship early on, because I think it's really interesting when you have these enormous people that become really world changers and culture shifters in a lot of ways, and then they cross paths. You know, it's always kind of like an interesting thing. And there was a period of time where they were basically each other's best friend. And I thought, well, I'm well read in this stuff. Why don't I know any of these stories about, you know, them going out to dinner and chatting about movies or whatever? I mean, we know they work together on some projects, but But the whole idea of like, you know, George Lucas flying in to Spielberg's set and being depressed that the Star Wars at the time was going to be terrible. And Spielberg's like, listen, man, you got this. What you have looks amazing. And, you know, it's going to be a bigger hit than whatever I'm doing. And, you know, why don't we trade points on our next films? Because I believe in it that much. And it's like those little moments that you think, wow, these were once just now they're institutions, but these were once just, you know, creative people that were trying to make something that they believed in, and not a lot of other people did. So I thought the story was amazing. I thought I would love to see that movie. And then I thought we have the ability to tell a story sonically that can be done in my own opinion better than any podcasts that were out there, at least at the time, and started to kind of put together a strategy for building it out as, you know, that first season as a 6 episode thing that's basically the runtime of a feature film. And you know, thought, okay, well, if we have this, then we have to have original music for this, and we have to, you know, it was like a lot of those things, but we basically tried to take kind of the indie film approach to the people that we were bringing in to record, bringing in to do music, and the sound designer that I have is just like incredible. Peter Bovietz's his name. He's just a brilliant mind. Works on Hollywood films as well. So it ended up being one of these things. It's like, okay, this is going to be a little bit different than what we've seen before. This isn't going to be a fiction story. You know, we have encountered that thing when it's like, hey, should we submit to some award, you know, some podcast award thing? And it's like the categories are documentary or scripted, or documentary or fiction. Fiction is used a lot too. And we're like, well, it's kind of, we are recreating real conversations, you know, some interview someone had in 1995 about what they did in 1979, you know, and then we're kind of trying to piece everything together out of real journalism. So it was kind of a different kind of format for that in a lot of ways. But that was part of the excitement, I think, for me and for our team as well. And then for season 2, we ended up working with Cadence 13. And that was a little bit bigger series. We got Ross Marquand from The Walking Dead to be our James Cameron, and did 10 episodes of that. So yeah, it was kind of taking, I think, a lot of the fiction elements, and basically trying to, you know, do a ton of research on the journalism end, and then creating a slightly different output for that. So you're doing the work of a you know, NPR podcast, and then trying to create something that's scripted after that. So it's a little bit more work, but we found it really, really fulfilling, and it's fun.
Yeah. And can you talk about, is there a 3rd season coming, or is that still under wraps, or?
It's under, there will be, yes.
And
I can't tell you who it's about yet.
Yeah, it could be another iconic filmmaker.
Yeah, for Blockbuster, yeah.
All right, cool. And I'm going to start to get to some of the questions that are coming in. So this is something for everybody, and I want to kind of broaden this question. So if people are listening to this and they might be filmmakers more in the traditional space, and they want to kind of get into scripted podcasting, what would be kind of the advice that you would give them if they were starting? And also, like, are there I mean, I know this is kind of a space that's very new still, but are there programs, you know, kind of to support kind of aspiring or, you know, emerging, you know, kind of scripted podcast, you know, content creators, like a Sundance Lab or anything like that? So, you know, Holly, why don't we start with you on that one? Like, what?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually have a program internally called Sound Up, which looks at taking voices that are typically not heard and helping them through that process. And we've gotten a large, we did both scripted and unscripted podcasts through that program. So that's something to look at. In terms of other programs, I would ask Josh and Matt, but I just know that that's a Spotify one that we've got going. The other thing I would say is, like, listen to a lot of the ones that we've mentioned today, because a lot of people come in and then there needs to be a clear reason, why does this work in audio? For the most part, so many people have just pitched whatever busted TV or film pilot or script, and it didn't work there, so let me do this. This is going to be super easy, and it's not. And so it's really conceptualize, why does it work? Do your research on what's already out there. We've mentioned everything from Moonface to The Shadows to, Welcome to Night Vale. The No Sleep podcast is a really interesting one, especially if you listen to the first episodes to now. Like, the evolution of scripted podcasting is incredibly clear, and it's really interesting to you can just literally take the first and the last, and it'll be like a light years difference. And then call Josh.
Well, that's a nice segue over to you, Josh. Like, what advice would you give for people who want to kind of explore this space?
Yeah, my advice is do it. That's something that I love about podcasting so I'm privileged to be in a position where I get to support storytellers and telling their stories, and we get to broker these deals for them. But there are not gatekeepers in this space. I am not a gatekeeper. I can't stop you from making shows. Holly can't stop you from making shows. That's what I think is really great about this space. If you've got an idea, a story you're passionate about telling, I think just do it, and I strongly encourage people to collaborate, bring together teams, right? Because so much of what's great in scripted right now is you're seeing people come together where you have a writer and an actor and a director and, different people getting involved in making these, and, find your network, right? Find people that you want to work with on this. And, tell the stories that you're really passionate about telling and that make sense for audio. Like Holly said, we know when you're sending us your failed TV pilot, I think playwrights make really good writers for podcasts, right?
Agreed.
Because when you think about what works in audio, you don't want a lot of scene changes. You don't want a huge cast. You don't want the thing Matt was talking about of like, thanks for meeting me here in the library, Matt. Good to see you, Matt. Think about having a small cast with diverse voices, and people sound different. You can identify different voices. Think about the ways in which you can make your show great. But I'd really encourage people to just take swings and try stuff. I guess one program that I would shout out is for the film festival crowd out there. The Austin International Film Festival also has a whole audio track, and they've done a great job of supporting young up and coming scripted audio creators.
And as an agent, Josh, are you always kind of on the lookout, or I guess listening for, kind of new voices, new podcasts? Like, is that something that you're interested in finding new kind of, talent that you can kind of represent as well?
Yeah, of course. I'm always looking for talent. I am more likely to find talent through them making a good show that I get to listen to and see how great it is than I am from someone reaching out and being like, I have this amazing idea, because like, obviously me and my team, we get inundated with a lot of ideas, and we have certain restrictions around accepting unsolicited submissions, of course, as, any Hollywood agency does. So to break through, I think that the proof is in the pudding a little bit. I think that, if you make something and it's undeniable, then there's no one who can stop you in this space. You can get straight to your audience, and then you'll have me and other podcast agents competing to get your attention, right? Versus knocking down our doors and trying to like sell us on the vision of what you could create, especially if you're totally new to audio. We want to know that you can do it, and that you, like, if you haven't had other audio successes in the past, like, Holly mentioned earlier, she had a great phrase, like, why does this need to be scripted audio? Why does it need to exist? And like, my question is like, why is it your story? Why is this the story? Why is this the production that we need to get behind? Because it's wide open, and it's also very competitive in this space, especially when you're trying to get people to invest real money into creating a show that doesn't exist yet. So, I am privileged to work with the cream of the crop, with, really talented creators who are in the top of their game from whatever genre or medium they're coming from, as well as, people who are on the top of their game in audio and are really proven in this space. And the vast majority of those people started by just making stuff and started by just practicing and honing their craft to get to this point where we are today.
Yeah. And to follow up on that, another listener had this question where they wanted to know a little bit about kind of how the story structure works. So you talked earlier, Josh, about kind of most podcasts are kind of in that, kind of TV serialized or episodic kind of format. If people are making their own podcasts, like, do you have a recommendation for, should it be like, make like half-hour episodes or make little short things, or just kind of in terms of how they should structure and script it? Like what advice would you give to that?
Well, creative comes first. So don't ever let an agent or an executive tell you what your thing needs to be structured like, I think if you've got a vision for a 4-hour long audio file that's going to change the world, and like make it, if you are open to suggestion, I would say that like serializing it, it's from a PR and marketing standpoint, having something that's coming out once a week and creating this habit with your listeners is a really great way to build an audience, So I'd say if you have a story that you'd want to tell in roughly 30-minute, maybe 22-minute intervals, that's a really great way to go. I am of the camp of like walk before you run, and I would rather hear like 8 or even 3 incredible minutes than like 30 mediocre minutes, So like, especially if you're making one of your first projects, I mean, less is more. Like I would just really focus on execution and making a really, really great product. And there's great shows that are super short. I mean, this one isn't scripted, but there's an amazing show called The Memory Palace that's been running for like a decade plus. And, Nate DeMeo makes his episodes as long as the episode needs to be. And so he has episodes that are literally 2 or 3 minutes long and episodes that are 22 minutes long. And he doesn't have to go out and apologize to the audience because he's giving it to you for free. He doesn't owe you a 22-minute episode if he wants to make a 3-minute one,
Yeah.
It's in scripted, there's something that we've also, it's actually across all podcasts. Like on our platform, we've seen a lot of drop off. So people will typically give you 90 seconds. So if they're going to test it out, they're going to give you about 90 seconds. So what are you going to do to grab someone? So if you're thinking of it in a cold open TV sort of way, like what's that hook that you're going to get right away? And then you can slow roll and be your like, very indie, whatever self. But like, what are those first 90 seconds? We've also, again, I would look at the field is so nascent. So you can play with things. We're trying out a daily soap opera right now where we've got something in development like that. And I'm not saying we're moving forward with it yet, so no press here. But like we're playing with it in development because that's something that could be really interesting. But that would be maybe 5 to 10 minutes a day because you don't want to be overwhelmed. We're looking at something. We've got something in development that's been looking at like a feature, and we're deciding like, should it be a feature? Should it be less episodes? And so we're playing with that conversation. We've found that like 20 to 45 minutes. So like the sweet spot of being 30 is pretty good to hold your attention for a scripted, because also you can always, you can binge listen if you need.
Yeah.
So.
Actually, we're almost up with the hour. Can you stay on for like maybe 5 more minutes, get to a couple of more questions? And if you have to leave, please,
I've got 5.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Please feel free to. Sorry, we have so many questions. I didn't realize how quickly this time went. So Matt, as the creator, as kind of as a person here that you're making podcasts, what advice would you give, to those out there who want to kind of start, in this space?
Envision it and then go make it. Find a way to go do it. If you're that passionate about it, then that's going to show in the work, and you'll find a way. Which I know is not that terribly helpful for people that are really misguided. But I left my job in the news industry to make a feature documentary. I didn't know how to make a feature documentary. I knew at the time I didn't know what the steps would be, and I was just kind of learning about the basics of distribution when we were finishing up the film and thinking like, oh, wait, what is this? How does all of this stuff work? But if you're really passionate about the project, you're going to go talk with people. You're going to go find, people that will have answers that have been through that before. Other, films that you like, if it's in film stuff. I talked to lots of filmmakers about ways that they did things. And some of those cases I said, I don't know if I want to do it your way, and take a chance with something that I thought would work a little bit better. It should be an informed guess, but it can still kind of be a guess if there's a reason for it. And it was the same thing with the scripted podcast. I hadn't done a scripted podcast before. I hadn't done anything dramatized before. But the story itself was so strong enough, in my opinion, that I felt like it gave a lot, push through the first 80%, get it on a page, start to chisel away at the things that don't quite work. If at any point you realize this whole thing is going to all be a huge waste, you can always stop at that point. But my thought is, like, get your passion on the page and then follow that passion as long as it'll take you, because ultimately that's how you're going to get really great stuff.
Let's see if we can get to one or two more questions. So here's one from another viewer. So once someone's made their podcast, let's say they've gone out, they've taken the initiative, what's that next step? Like, how important is it that you get that 5-star review on iTunes? Like, are there support networks out there to kind of help get your podcast out there? Like, what are kind of the ways that they can, frankly, for people like you, Holly and Josh, like, get your attention once they've made the podcast, and assuming that they've made a great one. So Josh, why don't we start with you on that one?
Well, first of all, you want to get that 5-star review on Spotify as well, not just iTunes.
I was thinking it. Thank you.
I think that try and get a lot of attention on your show right as it's launching. The charts are heat charts by and large, right? They're not ranking shows by how many downloads they have. They're shooting up things that are brand new because they want to show you new shows. So if you can get a lot of traction right at launch, your stuff will shoot way up in the charts. And then it kind of has this snowball effect when people check it out. And then, as Holly said, you need to grab them in the first 90 seconds, right? You need to have a good product to keep them coming back. I think that's really important. I believe that by and large, this is a meritocracy. I think that good stuff really does rise to the top. But, of course, you've got to market, and if you have social media you can leverage, there's a big conversion rate, especially between Instagram and Twitter and podcasts. If you have a cast, you have other people involved in your show, like, get everyone on the same team and market the hell out of it together. I think that also there's a lot of press that wants to write about podcasts. It's an area people are interested in and want to read about. And so few shows think to go and reach out to press. I think I've reached out to reporters, they focus a little bit more on just the promotion of the crossover podcast, which is also super valuable and a great discovery tool. Guesting on shows, et cetera, is super, super helpful. But, go out and reach out to journalists and give them an easy story that they can just, throw up on their website or in their publication. Do them a favor and they'll do you a favor.
Holly, did you want to add anything to Matt's advice there?
No, he covered it.
Add anything from you?
No, I would just say, like, the key has always been for me to follow your passion, follow what you really care about. And if it's not something you feel strongly about, don't do it. But if it is, then explore every possible option. And, like, there are lots of stupid questions that you can ask. You can ask yourself, that you can ask other people. It's only you and that other person that have to know that stupid question was ever asked, and maybe you'll get a great answer.
All right. So one final quick question then, and we'll wrap things up. We'll start with you, Holly. Like, this is the opportunity. What are some things coming out at Spotify that you want people to be aware of, or generally in the scripted podcast space in the future that you think people should be on the lookout for, things that you think will be happening?
I'm actually really excited about our deal with DC and Warner Brothers, and I think that that's something that we're really looking forward to some of the things that we'll be able to announce soon. But I can't really get into it right now, but that's the thing I'm really looking forward to at the moment.
Okay. Josh, what about you on your end as an agent?
Well, you mentioned earlier Jordan Peele's Monkey Paw Productions, and we don't have not a ton we can say about that yet, but there was an announcement about that, about a project coming from Spotify and Monkey Paw, and I'm very, very excited for that project. So stay tuned. I think that one's going to be a real game changer.
Yeah. Right. Matt, I know you can't talk about Blockbuster next season, but
we have a few that we can't talk about. We're right now we basically have three, one of those being Blockbuster, scripted things that are kind of in the works. So I'm very excited about all of that. I and my team, everything that we have considered, we basically talk about as a team and kind of do a loose brainstorm session to see if it's something that we want to really go down and pursue further, which has been a method that's really helped us stay super engaged and excited about all the projects. So we think that of course, a lot of creative people think this, I know, but we think that we're doing things that have never been done before and in many ways better than they've been done before. So we're really, really excited for a lot of the things that we're doing with Epiclef Media, our production company.
Cool. So we've come to the end of this panel, and it's gone by really quickly. And like, there's so many questions we did not get to. Whole, big range of topics. So hopefully, we'll get to do this again next year in person in Hawaii, and we can go into even a deeper dive, about all of this. But first of all, I want to thank our guests, Matt, Holly, and Josh, for taking the time from their busy schedule to join us. Thank you, everybody, for watching this. And again, we hope to do this more because, again, I know there's a lot of questions we didn't get to today. And a special mahalo to all the HIFF sponsors, the board of directors, the Ohana members, everyone involved with the film festival for their hard work. Please go to HIFF.org, support them, support their 4440 program. Support scripted podcasts. Go and listen to all these great programs that we talked about today, and more importantly, go out and make them. And hopefully by next year, it'd be great to hear that some people are listening to this and they have their own podcast that they want to share as well. So thank you, everybody, for this session, and we will see you next time. Mahalo.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you. Bye.